Did you say something? She whispered, in case she'd imagined the sound. He turned to look at her. The bruise was taking on a livid, purplish hue, and his eye was swollen almost shut. Stay, he said gruffly, and she wavered before admitting to herself that she didn't want to leave him anyway. Just for a while, she conceded. She took off her jacket and pulled one of the decorative chairs over to the bed. She curled up in it, pulling her bare feet up and tucking them beneath her butt. With only his bedside lamp providing light, the room felt cozier than it actually was. She could see him clearly in the warm, yellow glow, but knew that she was sitting just outside the little circle of light and was not as easily visible to him, which allowed her to study his features hungrily. Even with the swelling, the gauzy patch above his eye, and the bruises, he was still a remarkably good-looking man. But that wasn't what riveted her. Instead, it was the naked vulnerability she could see on his face that held her captive. She doubted that he was even aware of the expression. He was on the verge of falling asleep, every muscle in his body and face going limp as his exhaustion overtook him. Cleo stayed a while longer, watching him, enjoying the silence and knowing that despite the closeness they'd experienced tonight, tomorrow would see them back in their respective corners, facing off in the endless battlefield that was their relationship. She waited until she was certain he was asleep, then stumbled to her own room and crawled into bed after taking off the least amount of clothes necessary for her to be comfortable. And then she fell into a thankfully dreamless slumber. You look awful, Cleo said with a wince when Dante joined her for breakfast the following morning. Geez, does that hurt? Like a son of a bitch, he grunted, gingerly probing at his swollen eye with his fingers. Don't touch it, she admonished. You'll make it worse. How are you this morning? He asked, peering at her through his one good eye. Fine. I have a huge bruise on my chest from the airbag, and the entire area is a bit tender, but it's nothing serious. It actually hurt more than she was letting on because of her already sensitive breasts, but there was no point in complaining since there wasn't any pain medication she'd feel comfortable taking anyway. Dante poured himself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table opposite Cleo, who was having a bowl of cereal. You're not eating? She asked, and he made a face and shook his head. Do you want to do something today? Something like what? Cleo asked in confusion, and Dante shrugged, looking a little discomfited. I was thinking we're heading into week 20. And baby's about the length of a banana, so we should probably call her Nan this week. The baby had been Tom last week because he'd been about the size of an heirloom tomato. It was a silly game that had evolved between them when they discovered a fruit and vegetable comparative size chart to go along with their weekly growth updates. She'd been Pepper at week 18 when they'd first started this game. I thought we could go do some shopping for her room. But we don't even know how big the room will be, Cleo said, and Dante's face became an expressionless mask. Cleo, you can't mean to move out as soon as she's born? You'll need help during those first few months. Months? She squeaked. You expect me to stay here for months after she's born? Dante, no. You said you'd help us find a place to stay. It's in the contract, and that's what I'm expecting from you. I'll get Mrs. Clark started on the search for a place first thing in the morning, he said after a long silence, and her shoulders slumped in relief. She shoved her half-eaten cereal aside. It's Mrs. Whitman now, she reminded him. Yes. I'd forgotten. He stared down into his cup of coffee as if it held the key to unlocking all the secrets in the universe. We could go window shopping, he suggested. And maybe get a basic idea of the stuff you'd need for Nan's nursery. Why are you so keen on doing this? She asked, and he lifted and dropped his shoulders again. Maybe I want to feel involved, he said. Or maybe I'm just bored and want to get out of here today. This seems to be the most productive thing to do, and it is an activity that would interest both of us. His answer surprised her. You would find shopping for baby stuff interesting? I've never bought baby things before. It would be educational, at the very least. Cleo considered his words. She did need some new clothes, since her skirts and trousers were getting too tight in the waist. She'd been thinking of getting a few maternity dresses. But she didn't want them to be obviously maternity dresses. She always imagined awful, frumpy, tent-like frocks whenever she thought of maternity wear, and those were so not her style. She was hoping to find some fun, loose tops and dresses and drawstring trousers and skirts, which her changing body could grow into. "Okay," she said. "If you're sure you're up to it, I wouldn't mind going out. I need some stuff anyway." Their first stop was a large high-end baby store in Greenpoint, and the moment she set foot inside, Cleo was overwhelmed by the sheer amount of tastefully displayed products. This wasn't at all what she'd expected from a baby shop. Discreet and soothing tunes played in the background, and the place smelled like expensive wood. There were no price tags in sight, which made Cleo nervous. They were approached by several salespersons, all of whom homed in on Cleo and Dante like sharks smelling fresh blood, and Cleo felt a little intimidated by the predatory gleam in their eyes. A woman about 2 years younger than Cleo reached them first, and her colleagues backed off and disappeared into the woodwork, like wraiths. The saleswoman turned a 100-watt smile onto her potential new clients. "Good morning, ma'am, sir. I'm Kate. May I be of assistance?" Cleo peered at Dante, who, with his arms folded across his chest, seemed to be waiting for her to say something. Cleo was tempted to turn down Kate's offer, but another look around the bewildering array of baby paraphernalia and Dante's impassive face changed her mind for her. "I need, well, everything," she said helplessly. She felt a little inadequate when she acknowledged to herself that she wasn't certain exactly what babies needed, aside from love, care, food, and clothing. As she watched Kate's smile transform from 100 watts to 100,000 megawatts, Cleo realized it was the worst reply she could have given. "Well, then," Kate said smugly, "you've come to the right place, because we have everything." She lowered her eyes to Cleo's barely protruding stomach, and her smile turned simpering. "You're first?" Cleo nodded, and Kate's smile became beatific. She certainly had an amazing variety of smiles. "How far along are you?" "Just on 5 months," Cleo replied. "Babies are wonderful, aren't they?" Kate gushed. "So full of life." "I wouldn't know." Cleo's response was dry. "I don't have a baby yet." Dante made a little choking sound that Cleo was coming to recognize as his attempt at disguising a laugh. Another quick look in his direction confirmed that his lips had tilted upward, even while he kept his gaze firmly averted from Cleo's. Kate's smile faded somewhat. She clearly did not like having the obvious pointed out to her, of course. The woman nodded before going into full-on sales mode. "Well, the best place to start would be with a crib. If you'll follow me, we have a fantastic variety, which I am sure you'll adore. Everything we have here is for display purposes, and your crib will be built to order, so we can change aspects of any design if you're not happy with something. We could even custom build one for you based on a design you have in mind. So it's a good thing you came to us this early, because it takes time to make, especially if you're purchasing matching furniture, which will also have to be built to order." Kate led them to the cribs in the back, and even to Cleo's untrained eye, she could tell that everything was ridiculously expensive. While Kate was lauding the merits of one of the beautiful cribs, Cleo gravitated toward a smaller, less conspicuous one tucked away in the back. While not as beautiful as the rest, it definitely looked less pricey. "This one looks okay," she said, running her hands over the plain, unadorned surface of the crib. Actually, this plain, boxy little thing was not something she had ever pictured her baby in. But if she wasn't going to feel beholden to Dante for the rest of her life, instinct told her this was the one to take. "I rather like this one." Dante spoke for the first time since they'd entered the store, and both women looked at him in surprise. He was standing beside a crib smaller than the one Kate was gushing over, but bigger than the one Cleo had been eyeing. Truth be told, it was perfect, not too small and not too ostentatious either. She knew what he was doing. He was trying to help, without flaunting his obvious ability to buy the most expensive and best. He was allowing her some measure of pride and independence, and she was grateful to him for that. But a cynical part of her brain hissed that if he didn't want to flaunt his ability to buy the most expensive, then maybe he shouldn't have brought her to this snooty upmarket store, she walked over to the crib while he examined its lines and tested its durability with a keen masculine eye. He asked Kate about the toxicity of the varnish they used and other technical questions that wouldn't have occurred to Cleo. The girl's answers seemed to satisfy him, because he nodded approvingly with each of her replies before turning back to Cleo. "It's sturdy," he informed her quietly. "Before testing the catches. And the rail isn't likely to come down accidentally. The baby should be safe in here." She murmured thoughtfully, pretending to consider, even though he'd sold her on it already. "It's pretty too. I love the little pixies and fairies carved into the head and footboards, as well as the mobile." She touched the colorful mobile, which swayed at her touch. The mobile consisted of winged fairies and cavorting pixies and elves. "I like this one," she told Kate, who jumped to attention and enthused over their wise choice. "This particular model comes in teak, oak, and pine. Obviously, the price varies according to the wood you choose. Which would you prefer?" Cleo considered the choices, while Kate pulled out a catalog to show her the difference in the wood teak. She ran her finger over the carvings in the headboard of the crib and thought of her own bed. She liked the idea of them matching, and she pictured Nan sleeping contentedly in this crib and smiled. Kate practically vibrated with excitement as she wrote down the details of the order and then took them toward the changing tables. "That was an excellent choice, Dante. I don't know why I didn't notice it at first." He looked pleased with her praise and grinned like a little boy. "You think so?" "Yes. Thank you. And it has given me an idea for the nursery. What do you think of a fairy tale motif?" Dante hesitated, a little surprised that she'd asked for his opinion. He didn't want to do anything that could spoil what was turning out to be a pretty good day, but he really had to tell her what he thought of this idea of fairies. "You want my honest opinion?" he asked. They were both ignoring poor Kate's frantic attempts to get their attention, while Cleo lowered her eyelashes and pretended to consider his question. "Honesty would be appreciated," she said demurely. "What if it's a boy?" he asked. "You can't seriously want to surround the kid with fairies and pixies? That's girly stuff." "No, it's not," she argued, quite affronted by this view. "Fairies and pixies sometimes have a dangerous air to them, and they're appealing to a child of any sex. If it's a boy and he wants to change his room later, that would be entirely up to him." He didn't respond. Instead, he gazed at her impassively. Cleo couldn't read his expression and wasn't certain of his mood, especially since he was wearing dark glasses to hide part of his shiner. His lips thinned and he sighed quietly. "Must you argue?" "You seem to forget that you asked for my opinion," he said gravely. "Cleo, sometimes you can be so damned frustrating?" She supplied with a sympathetic nod. "No, annoying?" She guessed, and he gave her the look, which shut her up immediately. He really was so super anal about her finishing his sentences. "Cute," he said with playful smile, and shocked the hell right out of her. "Sometimes you can be so damned cute." Oh. Well, how else was she supposed to respond to that? "Are you flirting with me?" She really couldn't tell. Dante Damaso did nothing conventionally. "What if I were?" he asked speculatively, and she pondered over that for a moment. "I'd tell you to stop," she finally replied. "It's weird." "Maybe I'm wooing you," he said. "To what end?" "You know what," he countered, confirming her worst fear. "Well, stop it at once. I gave you my answer Friday night. It's not just a no, it's a hell no." As if she would marry a man who didn't love her. "Okay," he said so casually that she blinked at him uncertainly. His response was unexpectedly easygoing, and it threw her a little. "I'm assuming you have the accompanying pieces to this crib." He directed the comment to Kate, who'd been watching their exchange with interest. Yes. Of course." She was just way too enthusiastic. Cleo wished the woman a stroller, a baby bouncer, a rocking chair, and a car seat later. Cleo, deciding new clothes could wait another day or two, pleaded exhaustion, and Dante, who was also looking a bit pale and peaked, agreed that it was best to head home. She went straight up to bed when they got home and fell asleep almost instantly. Her sleep was restless and filled with disturbing dreams, and when she awoke hours later, it was to an even worse headache. She took a warm bath to try and relax her muscles and ease her tension, and it seemed to work to a certain extent. Her headache had definitely diminished enough for her to face going downstairs to dinner. Dante was in the kitchen, cooking something that smelled divine. He smiled when he saw her. "I hope you're hungry," he said, and she sat down at the island to watch him. The scene was reminiscent of that first night he'd cooked for her. "I could eat. I made some paella, my second stepmother's recipe." That woman was a genius in the kitchen, which was great, since none of the old man's other wives bothered. They thought cooking was beneath them, and they married a rich man, so cooking was something the chef did. He was unusually forthcoming tonight, and Cleo rested her cheek in the palm of her hand and idly traced the pattern of veins on the marble countertop. "Did you like any of your stepmothers?" "That one, stepmom number 2? She was my favorite. Taught me a thing or two about cooking. The rest were just..." His voice faded as he thought about it. "I don't know, interchangeable maybe. After number 2, I stopped trying to get to know them." "Did you act out?" Cleo asked, thinking of her own rebellious years. "I was a good kid, got the best grades and stayed out of trouble. I didn't have many friends. I still don't." And he'd lost one of his best friends because of her, Cleo thought, swallowing past a lump in her throat. "It was only when I hit puberty that I started getting into fights, and my father thought it best for me to take boxing classes in order to channel that aggression. It worked. One of his more sound parental decisions." "Do you get along with him?" she asked. "We get along now. He wasn't too happy when I decided to stay here. However, since I've made a success of the business, he's back in the black and able to fund his current wife-to-be, Carmen's, spendthrift ways. So he's come to accept the idea. I love him, he's my papa, but we're not friends. If we go a year or more without seeing each other, both of us are fine with that. We're both happy with a few Skype sessions a year." "That's sad." "I don't think so," he said with a little shrug. "It's life. Sometimes we get along with our parents. And sometimes we don't." Her hand went to her abdomen, and she silently promised her child better than that. Dante's eyes followed her hand to her stomach, and his Adam's apple bobbed as he swallowed thickly. "I would want a different relationship with her," he said softly. "I didn't know this at first, Cleo, but I do know it now. I want to be a real father to Nan, and I don't want her to go through the turmoil of numerous step-parents. Just us. Her mother and father. What you're proposing is a cold and cynical arrangement that will result in a cold and cynical environment unsuited for raising a child. Please don't bring this up again. I don't want to marry you, and I know that it's not what you want either." "Not really. I've come to..." He hesitated, clearly picking his words carefully. "I've come to like and respect you, Cleo, and I do think we can have a good marriage together." "Oh my God." She jumped up and planted her hands on her hips. "That's not enough, Dante. I don't want good. I want amazing, I want fantastic, I want blissful. I want love, and you can't give that to me." "Who says I can't?" His handsome face was a study in frustration and building anger. Cleo gasped at his words and pinned him with a glare. "Don't you dare." She whispered. "Don't you dare treat me with such condescension and downright contempt, Dante. I'm not an idiot, so don't even think about going down that road. I don't need this someday we might come to love each other speech. I don't want to hear it. It's insulting. This isn't easy for me either, Cleo," he snapped. "I'm trying my damnedest to think of ways we can make this work for both of us, and you're not making it easy." "I'm not talking about this again," she maintained, rolling her aching shoulders as she headed back toward the staircase. "Where are you going?" "I don't feel like doing this with you right now," she said. "I'm headed back to my room." "You haven't eaten." "I've lost my appetite." Cleo, you should eat for the baby's sake. Dante, I can't sit at that table with you and pretend that everything is just fine. I wish to God that I'd never agreed to live here with you. It was a dumb decision that has already cost me my pride, my independence, and my brother. He flinched and went as white as a sheet at the last two words, but Cleo refused to feel any guilt over it. It was time Dante Damaso accepted that, for once, he wasn't going to get his way. She was sitting on her bed, listlessly clicking through the multitude of channels available on the wall-mounted large-screen television, when a sharp knock sounded on her door. She ignored it and sighed impatiently when the door swung open despite her lack of response. Dante stepped in and placed a loaded tray on her dresser before leaving without saying a word. Cleo couldn't ignore the heavenly aromas and got off the bed to investigate the contents. There was a small bowl of salad beside a plate laden with delicious-looking seafood paella and a slice of rich, moist chocolate cake on a side plate. He had also been thoughtful enough to include a silver carafe of cold water. Cleo's mouth watered. She dragged over a chair and sat right at the dresser and scarfed down half of the paella and salad in one go. It was absolutely perfect. Definitely one of the perks of living with Dante was his cooking. The man loved being in the kitchen, and it showed in the meals he prepared. After polishing off her meal, she practically inhaled the cake, which was absolutely delicious, and there was no doubt in her mind that it had been baked by Dante. After finishing, she considered going downstairs to thank him, but the thought of going another round with him was mentally exhausting, so she sent him a thank you text instead. "You're welcome. Glad you enjoyed it." His response was almost immediate. She contemplated sending him a smiley face or something in return, but decided to leave it at that. 10 minutes went by before her phone buzzed again. "Want to watch Star Trek with me?" It was the equivalent of a white flag, since Star Trek had become kind of an in-joke between them, but she didn't think she could face him again tonight. "No thanks. Tired. Going to sleep, good night." She decided not to respond to his good night and curled up on her bed, her hand on her little bump. Nan shifted gently beneath her touch, and Cleo smiled before falling asleep with the TV still on. Chapter 13, she awoke with a gasp. The TV was on, playing quietly in the background, the light flickering in the darkened room. Something's wrong. She tried to push herself up and nearly doubled over in pain. This wasn't right. She tried to stand again, and this time succeeded for a few seconds before her knees buckled, and she groaned as excruciating pain knifed through her abdomen. "No," she moaned. She braced her palm on the night table and pushed herself up again, managing to keep her balance as she hugged the wall all the way to the bathroom. It was only when she got into the brightly lit room that she saw she was bleeding. The horror of the realization impacted her like a freight train, and she sat down on the commode as she tried to wrap her head around what was happening. Dante. His name was just a whisper, as her breath was stolen from her by another sharp pain. She gritted her teeth and clung to the basin beside the commode. After the pain had passed, she managed to inhale. Dante's name emerged on the exhalation. This time it was a scream.